this presentation, you will learn about historical particularism. Particularism, also called historical particularism, school of anthropological thought associated with the work of Franz Boaz and his students, whose studies of culture emphasize the integrated and distinctive way of life of a given people. Particularism stood in opposition to theories such as cultural evolution, culticaries, and geographical or environmental determinism, all of which sought to discover for the social sciences a series of general laws analogous to those in the physical sciences. The idea of historical particularism suggests all cultures have their own historical trajectory and that each culture developed according to this history. This idea was popularized by the anthropologist Franz Boaz, who is widely considered a founder of the discipline of anthropology. The term historical particularism refers to the idea that each culture has its own particular and unique history that is not governed by universal laws. This idea is a big component of Boazian anthropology because it is where Boazians put their focus on while studying cultures. Historical particularism was developed in contrast to Boaz's rejection of Lewis Henry Morgan's idea of an evolutionary path and the use of the comparative method. The evolutionary path used generalities and universal themes to explain cultural similarities, but Boaz contended that cultural traits first must be explained in terms of specific cultural contexts rather than by broad reference to general evolutionary trends. Boaz and his followers would argue that cultures cannot be compared or be subjected to generalities because each culture experienced a different and unique history, even if it led to a similar cultural aspect. Historical particularism and the concept of diffusion actually go quite hand in hand. Traits that are similar between cultures may have diffused through interaction between various cultures. However, while these traits are similar, they will develop different and unique histories from their movement through various societies. This approach claims that each society has its own unique historical development and must be understood based on its own specific cultural and environmental context, especially its historical process. Its core premises was that culture was a set of ideas or symbols held in common by a group of people who see themselves as a social group. Historical particularists criticized the theory of the 19th century social evolution as non-scientific and proclaimed themselves to be free from preconceived ideas. Boas believed that there were universal laws that could be derived from the comparative study of cultures. However, he thought that the ethnographic database was not yet robust enough for us to identify those laws. To that end, he and his students collected a vast amount of first-hand cultural data by conducting ethnographic fieldwork. Based on these raw data, they described particular cultures instead of trying to establish general theories that apply to all societies. Contribution of Franz Boaz. Franz Boaz and his students developed historical particularism early in the 20th century. Historical particularists valued fieldwork and history as critical methods of cultural analysis. At the same time, the anthropologists in this theoretical school had different views on the importance of individuals in a society. For example, Franz Boas saw each individual as the basic component of a society. He gathered information from individual informants and considered such data valuable enough for cultural analysis. On the other hand, Alfred Kroeber did not see individuals as the fundamental elements of a society. He believed a society evolves according to its own internal laws that do not directly originate from its individuals. He named this cultural aspect superorganic and claimed that a society cannot be explained without considering its impersonal force. Boaz's own work emphasized studies of individual cultures, each based on its unique history. He held that the anthropologist's primary assignment was to describe the particular characteristics of a given culture with a view toward reconstructing the historical events that led to its present structure. Implicit in this approach was the notion that resolving hypotheses regarding evolutionary development and the influence of one culture on another should be secondary to the careful and exhaustive study of particular societies. Boaz urged that the historical method, based on the description of particular culture traits and elements, supplant the comparative method of the evolutionists, who use their data to rank cultures in an artificial hierarchy of achievement. He rejected the assumption of a single standard of achievement to which all cultures could be compared, instead advocating cultural relativism, the position that all cultures are equally able to meet the needs of their members. Boas responded to a particular school of thought in anthropology known as the social evolutionary perspective. This approach saw cultures as following a linear trajectory. In other words, more traditional cultures will eventually catch up to the more developed cultures of Western Europe. The problem with the social evolutionary perspective, according to Boas, was that this led us to believe that Western European countries should be the model for what culture should look like. This led to ignoring the particularities of different cultures. This is where historical particularism comes in. Boas felt that the only way to really understand cultures was through in-depth research into their individual histories. We can't assume any universal laws about cultures. This blinds us to the important ways that cultures are different from one another. So, historical particularism is kind of like a research method in a way. Boas urged anthropologists to go directly to the place they wanted to study as opposed to trying to examine it from afar. This was a response to a tendency at the time to simply write about cultures rather than engaging with them. This led to what many termed armchair anthropology. Imagine it like this: a professor in the ivory tower making judgments about cultures he never really explored. Also, Boas didn't think that comparison was a very good way to understand other cultures. Instead of trying to find similarities and differences between two cultures, we should try and understand the aspects of each of them in depth. Under Boas's influence, the particularist approach dominated American anthropology for the first half of the 20th century. From World War II through the 1970s, it was eclipsed by neo-evolutionism and a variety of other theories. However, the particularist approach, if not the term itself, re-emerged in the 1980s as scholars began to recognize that distinctive historical processes differentiate peoples even in the era of globalization. Let us summarize. Historical particularism was a dominant trend in anthropology during the first half of the 20th century. One of the achievements of the historical particularists was that they succeeded in excluding racism from anthropology. The 19th century evolutionists explained cultural similarities and differences by classifying societies into superior and inferior categories. Historical particularists showed that this labeling is based on insufficient evidence and claimed that societies cannot be ranked by the value judgment of researchers. Historical particularists were also responsible for showing the need for long-term, intensive field work in order to produce accurate descriptions of cultures. One important part of doing that was to learn the language of the study group. Boas stressed the apparently enormous complexity of cultural variation, and perhaps because of this complexity, he believed it was premature to formulate universal laws. He felt that single cultural traits had to be studied in the context of the society in which they appeared. In 1896, Boas published an article entitled "The Limitation of the Comparative Method of Anthropology," which dealt with his objections to the evolutionist approach. In it, he stated that anthropologists should spend less time developing theories based on insufficient data. Rather, they should devote their energies to collecting as much data as possible, as quickly as possible, before cultures disappeared. He asserted that valid interpretations could be made and theories proposed only after his body of data was gathered. Boas expected that if a tremendous quantity of data was collected, the laws governing cultural variation would emerge from the mass of information by themselves. According to the method he advocated, the essence of science is to mistrust all expectations and to rely on facts. But the facts that are recorded even by the most diligent observer will necessarily reflect what that individual considers important. Collecting done without some preliminary theorizing, without ideas about what to expect, is meaningless, for the facts that are most important may be ignored, whereas irrelevant ones may be recorded. Although it was appropriate for Boaz to criticize previous armchair theorizing, his concern with innumerable local details did not encourage a belief that it might be possible to explain the major variations in culture that anthropologists believe. Thank you for watching the presentation.